Hello, the name of this message is called The Waiting Father, and I'd like to start out by reading from a verse in Romans 2:4. Don't you see how wonderfully kind, tolerant, and patient God is with you? Does this mean nothing to you? Can't you see that His kindness is intended to turn you from sin? Last year, a movie came out named Noah, and there was a lot of controversy over its context, mostly that it did not follow the biblical narrative so closely. Of course, it followed most of the story in the Bible. There was Noah. He built an ark. The animals came 2 by 2. They got in the ark. God closed the door. They were on the water for a long time. A flood happened. Everybody died. They got out. God restored mankind. They saved mankind through an ark. There was a rainbow. The end. But for me, I walked away from the movie thinking that the filmmaker did not represent the God that I knew. The God in this movie to me seemed cold and distant, a judge, very impersonal, and he left people to find his own way. This, I find, was in a big contrast to scripture I found in the book of Jeremiah. God is speaking to Israel, calling them back after they've chosen to forsake him. And it says this in Jeremiah 3:18 through 22. In those days, the people of Judah and Israel will return together from exile in the north. They will return to the land that I gave their ancestors as an inheritance forever. I thought to myself that I would love to treat you as my own children. I wanted nothing more than to give you this beautiful land, the finest possession in the world. I looked forward to you calling me Father, and I wanted you never to turn from me. In this passage, God is speaking to Israel, sharing his heart's desire for them to become his children once again. He wants to call them home. He wants to gather them, to give them a blessing, an inheritance, and a future. To be father to them, one who is loving, caring, and nurturing, and his only desire is for them to call him Father. But they keep turning away, as we know, over and over and over again, chasing lesser gods. We know the history of Israel was up and down in their relationship with God. But as we look deeper, we start to realize that the Israelites were more scared of God, of his awesome power, more than they were drawn to him and his love. There's a story that I've heard as a missionary which shares about the father's love for his son, and it goes like this. Swat lived in a poor village in the south of Bangkok in Thailand, and his father was a fisherman, and every day him and his father went out and they went fishing together. They would catch the fish, they'd bring it home, they'd sell it in the market, and they would go home. They would get up the next day, they would go fishing, they would bring the fish home, they would go to sell it in the market, and they would go home. And this happened day after day after day. And soon Swat decided that he was very bored with this lifestyle. He wanted something more. So he told his father, he said, "Father, give me some money, I want to go." So his father agreed, and they gave him his money. But he had disgraced his family and dishonored his father's name by just leaving the village. Swat entered into Bangkok, which is not much farther north of this little fishing village. And this is a big city full of excitements, full of people, full of things to do. And after some time there, he ran across a very different type of home. And in this house, he found there was many types of women in it, young and old. Some were happy, some were scared. This hotel was different than anything he's ever seen before. And he started going back there every single day. And soon he got caught up in the world of prostitution. And soon his money ran out. So he didn't know what else to do. So he realized the other customers coming there also wanted something else. And he started selling them opium. Over time, he had sold enough opium and he decided to expand his business. And he even started to buy and sell the girls themselves. This was a terrible, ugly business. But he soon required quite the small fortune. As luck would have it, one day, his bottom fell out. He came home, his house was robbed. He had nothing left, they took everything. And while he's sorting through his home, trying to put some pieces back together, there was a knock on the door. And he opened up the door and there was a policeman there, and they took him away and brought him to the police station. They started questioning him, questioning about his business practices and what he did. He shared a little bit, but not everything, and the police realized that after the day they had nothing that they could hold him on. There was no evidence, so he went home. That night he was home, there was another knock on the door, and it was his associates, the people that he worked with. And they too wanted to know what happened to him, and he explained the story about how he was robbed and that the police took him and they questioned him, and they didn't understand why the police let him go after a while, and all they could come up with is that he was informing on them. So they beat him and they kicked him out of the city. Swat found on the outside of town a small garbage dump, and he built a shack for himself, and after time he was eating from the garbage itself, clothing himself, and he decided after a few weeks of this lifestyle he had enough. So he decided to make a plan, and he wrote a letter. He decided he wanted to go home because it would be better for him to work for his father as a fisherman than to live in this garbage dump any longer. So he wrote this letter and said, "Father, I want to come home. I'm sorry for what I did. I would like to come home and just work for you. I know I'm disgraced you and the family name, and I can no longer be called your son. But if you would just take me to be one of your employees, I will work happily for you. Father, I will come on Saturday morning. I will be in a train, and I will know that you will accept me back if you tie a piece of cloth in front of the only tree in front of the train station. I will know I will get off, and you will accept me. If there's no cloth, then I know that I'll go to the next station and I'll find work." So that Saturday morning, Swat got up and he gets on the train, and he's nervous and he's jittery. And looking out the window, he's biting his nails. He's wondering what's going to happen with his life. There's a stranger in the seat across from him and sees how nervous this boy is. And he says, "Son, what is the problem?" So he explains the story. He tells about how he left home, he went to Bangkok and lost everything. And now he's going home to ask for forgiveness and to work for his father. Towards the end of this, as he's sharing this story, the train's coming closer to his train station. And the conductor yells out, "Next stop." So Swat is so emotional he can't even look out the window. So he asks the stranger, "Would you please look out the window for me and tell me if my father has tied a piece of cloth on the tree?" The stranger agreed. Swat hides his head down in his lap. He doesn't know what to expect. All of a sudden, the stranger starts to grab his arm and starts to shake him. Says, "Swat, Swat, you have to look out the window. Your father did not hang a white cloth, but he hung millions of cloths all over the tree, and his father was jumping up and down, waving a cloth. Come home, Swat, come home." Swat got off the train and ran into his father's arms. And his father says, "I have been waiting for you to come home." Swat's father was celebrating his son's return. He couldn't wait for him to come home. And all we want, I know, in life is to come home, to belong, is to be loved. In the Old Testament, the Jewish nation saw God as transcendent, a God of awesome power, someone you would tremble before in fear and in power beyond anything we could imagine. He was very distant, and the only appropriate response to him was to tremble before his presence. Think of all that the Israelites had experienced with God since they left Egypt. They saw the plagues. They saw the parting of the Red Sea, the destruction of the Egyptian army. They saw smoke on a mountain, a voice coming out that was booming and scared them to death. They also saw the walls of Jericho fall down without even attacking the city, but only marching around it. This is a God of awesome, awesome power, and he's worthy to be trembled before. But as God said in the book of Jeremiah, that is calling them to be children. He's calling them to himself. They do not really understand this loving attribute of God. So moving forward, Jesus comes onto the scene, and once again he's speaking to Israel, calling them home. And Jesus says this. He says, "If you have known me, you know the Father who sent me." I'd like to repeat that. Jesus says, "If you have known me, you know the Father who has sent me." Who was Jesus? He was kind, he was loving, he was tender-hearted, he was caring, he was encouraging, he was a healer, he was a provider. Yes, he cleansed the temple, and he rebuked the Pharisees for their religious acts. But he was calling people, he healed them, he took care of them, he fed them. Jesus was someone that people wanted to be with. He performed miracles. He taught with power and authority. He changed people's thinking, and the disciples fought to be next to him. Jesus shared that he was only an example of who God the Father was like. They could know God through knowing Jesus. They could know God through knowing Jesus. He wanted them to have confidence in God so that they would tremble before his power and also have confidence in his affections towards each one of them. You know, Jesus also shared a similar story as the story of Swat. And it was found in Luke 15:11 through 24. And we call it the prodigal son. Verse 11 starts like this. To illustrate the point further, Jesus told him this story. A man had two sons. The younger son told his father, I want my share of your estate now before you die. So his father agreed and divided his wealth between his two sons. A few days later, this younger son packed up all of his belongings and moved to a distant land. And there he wasted all of his money in wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him, but no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home, even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against both you and heaven, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Please take me on as your hired servant. So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. Filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son. He embraced him and kissed him. His son said to him, Father, I have sinned against both you and heaven, and I am no longer being worthy called your son. But his father said to his servants, Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet, and kill the calf that we've been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast. For this son of mine was dead, and now he's returned to life. He was lost, but now he's found. So the party began. We know the follow-up to this story. The older son comes out and says, Hey, what's going on? Why all the celebration? And he pulls his father aside and says, This brother of mine, he dishonored you, dishonored our family. Why are we celebrating? And his father's response to him is, Listen, your son, we thought he was dead, but he's alive. He's returned to us. It is time to celebrate. In this passage, we see the father's heart. The father let his son take advantage of him. He gave him money and saw him run away. He gave him the freedom to choose. In both stories, he didn't stop him. He did not disown him. He could have, because the son was bringing disgrace to his family. He only let him go. And we see that both sons in the two stories returned to the father, and the father accepted them back into his arms and family without a rebuke, without any punishment. Only celebration and forgiveness is given. We can learn three things from these two stories about God's heart for each one of us. The first thing is the freedom to choose. In both stories, the fathers loved their sons enough to let them leave home, to choose what they wanted to do with their lives, to go in the direction that they wanted to go, even though it was far from him and far from the ways that he raised them up to do. Both fathers created a deep possibility for a relationship with their sons in the future, for their willingness to allow the boys freedom. Both fathers, they grieved inwardly, but they did not force a relationship. The second thing we learn is that both fathers patiently waited for their return. He didn't go after them. In neither story does it say that the father sent out messengers, sent somebody to go check on them, how the other city. I'm sure over time that word came back from the other city about how poorly they were treating, because we could see that the older brother in the prodigal son knew that he had disgraced his family. But the fathers didn't send anybody after their sons. They let them go, because the fathers waited for both sons to reach an attitude of sorrow for their sins. They knew it had to be the young man's decision. So every day they waited for their sons, and they longed for their return. But they waited for them to come back, to realize, for them to come to their senses. They were patiently waiting for them. The third thing we learn is on the return of their son is that they were unconditionally accepted. There was no punishment. There was no chores. There was no penance waiting for them. Their fathers forgave them and restored them because their father loved them so much, and they were waiting for their return. They even celebrated their return with a feast and joyous celebration because their fathers, they welcomed them freely and completely to where they are. They loved them so much. Just to note here that God, our Father, He does not condone our rebellion. He does not condone our sin. He does not condone our selfishness or our pride. It grieves Him deeply that we move far away from Him because of these things in our lives. Yet, He constantly waits for us to respond to His love and to receive His forgiveness. In the story, in the passage about the lost son, we see the Father's heart, our Father God's heart. He is so quick to forgive and to restore their sons, To celebrate the returning home, in both stories, we neither see the father condemning the son nor rebuke him. And we see a forgiving father who is joyous over their child's return. For some of us, the love of the Father is so hard for us to comprehend. We have not had a good example in our own lives of this type of father. Or we grew up with an absent father or no father at all, and we cannot relate to somebody who is a father. But God is not like our earthly example of our Father. He is the perfect Father. He is everything we hoped for in a father. He is full of forgiveness. He is full of mercy. He is full of grace. He is full of restoration, and he's ready to celebrate anybody who comes back to him because he's calling each one of us home to him. God our Father is the one that we have longed for, we have looked for, and we have dreamed about. And he is waiting for us. The invitation is just waiting for us to take, to come home. In closing, I'd like to close with these words from 2 Corinthians 6:18. And I will be your father, and you will be my sons and my daughters, says the Lord Almighty. Come home. Come home. Thank you.